Okay, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to change my role certainly a little bit, and I'm going to moderate a discussion with our friends from the FAA, Transport Canada, and the International Civil Aviation Organization, otherwise known as ICAO. Often it's been said that safety is never in end state. Those of us in the safety business know it is ever changing and our work is never finished. We can never delude ourselves into thinking we got all the answers, and I know most of you know that. No flight is ever routine or just like the previous one. To some degree, there's always a unique set of conditions and circumstances that present a challenge to an otherwise safe and uneventful flight. We have to ensure the overall system is able to detect threats and alleviate high risk. Industry and regulators around the world are working towards a common vision, whether it is in areas appropriate to the appropriate use of safety data, safety management systems, voluntary safety reporting programs, or the safe integration of unmanned aerial systems, or as we like to refer to them, remotely piloted aircraft. There is always still work to be done. So I'd like to hear the perspectives from the regulators and our colleagues from ICAO on these subjects and what the industry has been doing right, along with their vision for the future, and areas that still need to be addressed, not only here in North America, throughout the world. So I'd like to introduce you to this very distinguished panel. To my left is Mr. John Hickey. He is the Deputy Associate Administrator for Aviation Safety at the Federal Aviation Administration. To his left is Mr. Martin Eley, Director General, Civil Aviation at Transport Canada. And on the far left is Mr. Mitchell Fox, Chief Flight Operations at ICAO. And you can see their full biographies in the back of your program. So let's go ahead and begin. Okay, I'm going to cut right to the chase. We're already hearing about a 200-pound remotely piloted helicopter that is applied to enter the National Airspace System. So, John, how soon before Amazon's going to be delivering a book on my doorstep with a vehicle like that?
Well, I'll leave the marketing of Amazon.com to Jeff Bezos, and but let me just sort of walk you through some of the steps that the FAA has taken today. The administrator has made it very clear that regarding the entry of UASs into the system is going to be done in a prudent step-by-step basis, and with safety at the foremost in our minds. Today, we have, as you know, that there was a congressionally directed 6 key test site areas that we're going to sort of get a lot of new information from. 4 of them have been stood up. The other 2 are not far behind being stood up. We have also issued the very first commercial type approved restricted category aircraft up in the Arctic, and they've been operating up there. And we've been very engaged in providing exemptions to a limited group of commercial operations as a result of the congressionally mandated section, what they call Section 333 in the reauthorization bill. So there's a lot of activities we're doing, but there's also a lot of stuff remaining. We really don't have standards that are appropriate yet for UASs. I think many of you know that hopefully we're going to have a proposal for the small UAS rule out later this year. And you know, there's always some of the critical technologies that still need to be solved, like sense and avoid. And so I think to some degree, it's not going to be as soon as some people tend to think there is.
Okay, interesting. In the rule that you're going to put out later this year, or the response you're going to put out later this year, are you going to see? Do you think you'll achieve some standards at that time, or is that still work in progress?
Well, remember, it's a small U.S. rule,
right?
And it's only an NPRM, so I don't think by virtue of the NPRM itself, we will have developed standards. But there are activities going on in the RTCA special committees to help look at standards, look at the ability to comply with Part 91 to be able to see and avoid.
Very good. Martin, what about in Canada? Where are we with UAS integration up there?
Integration is probably a long way away to start to answer that part of the question. In one sense, we were lucky. Back in 1996, we put in place a rule that allowed us to authorize UAVs, a Special Flight Operating Certificate. The bad news is that did not have any standards with it. It was just a general ability to issue an authority. So they've certainly taken off in the sense 3 years ago, we issued about 150 of those. Last year, it was 950. So clearly the volume is increasing. We've learned a lot along the way. A lot of those operations are commercial. The challenge is being able to put a fence around it. So a lot of them were dealt with individually. Based on that experience, we got some guidance that we're going to be putting out this fall, which will help our staff deal with them. They'll be less individual, but also the industry will have a better sense of what our expectations are in terms of what documentation do you need, how do you justify it, how do you show you have the right mitigations in place. We also have a working group. We have a long-term plan. There's 4 phases. The first phase is really below 25 kilograms within line of sight, which is the relatively easy piece, even though there's work to be done on that. And I think in that general area, there has been some discussion with the FAA, and we're in about the same sort of place. The similar types of operation, less complex. We've got a general sense of where we are. The biggest next step is obviously beyond line of sight, and I think that's a challenge, not because of any authority. The industry just isn't there yet with solutions for the smaller vehicles. And then the longer term phases are really getting into the bigger vehicles without limits eventually. So that's some years away. We are in the process of trying to determine on what sort of schedule we can get some rulemaking out there, at least for that lower group. So I'm hoping probably within the next year or two we will have something in place, which is probably going to be pretty much in line with the FAA's timescale.
I think you're right.
Are you two, is the U.S. and Canada, do you have an open dialogue between your two agencies on this subject?
The answer is, I think, yes, in a lot of areas. We have very different rule structures in the first place, so it doesn't mean the rules can be the same.
Right.
I'm not sure if you're aware that there is a Canada-US initiative called the RCC, the Regulatory Rulemaking, RCC, I can't even remember what it stands for. Anyway, it's a very high level driven on all sorts of subjects. There was one item for us in civil aviation in the first phase of that, and that was actually on the initial stage of UAV. So in that forum there has been, but certainly at a technical level, people are talking all the time.
Very good. Well, Mitch, bring in the global approach to this. What are you seeing at ICAO, and give us a perspective of how RPA and UAS is developing worldwide from your perspective.
Well, very much like my colleagues from national regulatory authorities, we're taking very much a step-by-step approach. In the blueprint that we see ahead for this type of technology, what we're trying to do to the extent possible is mirror what we do in terms of our international approaches to for RPA operations to what we do for manned operations. So in that respect, the UAS study group, which by the way very soon is going to be up-leveled to a full technical panel, we've been working ahead on looking at what sort of requirements would be necessary for the issuance of an air operator certificate for RPA operations, very much in line with manned operations. What type of requirements will remote pilots need to meet? The sort of Annex 1 international licensing requirements, as well as what are the airworthiness requirements for the vehicles themselves. And that's been the major focus of our work. Previously, back in about 2012, we came out with some enabling standards. They're very preliminary in nature. The first one is aircraft registration, actually recognizing remotely piloted aircraft as aircraft in the international context. And then in Annex 2, the rules of the air, which apply universally, especially over high seas airspace, was the initially enabling rules that would allow for one state to authorize another state's operation with a remotely piloted aircraft into their airspace. Those are only initial things. So again, the work's going to be focused on the pilot license areas, the air operator certificate, the airworthiness requirements. So our UAS study group has been working away for the last 2 or 3 years. In March of next year, they expect to roll out the RPA guidance manual. That's the first step leading towards the eventual development of international standards. And from the 23rd to the 25th of March 2015, we'll be having a global symposium to start to discuss the impact of RPAS in international operations, and gradually, in line with the aviation safety block upgrades, the aviation block upgrades, the eventual integration into non-segregated airspace for international operations. But that is a long-term process. We're looking at the first international standards in respect of licensing, the air operator certificate, airworthiness certification, and some enabling standards in Annex 10 in about the 2018 timeframe. And then we'll be looking for biennial updates of those standards as the technologies mature. Certainly, as John mentioned, sense and avoid is an issue that we're looking at through the study group, and again, that work will continue with the panel.
Good, very interesting. You know, the two big international initiatives, of course, is RPA, UAS, and of course, NextGen. You know, this just I'd be interested in your thoughts. Are RPAs and UASs, should that be an integral part of NextGen, or are RPAs and UAS just another operator within NextGen? And I guess I'm asking, do you see this as being integrated in consideration as we move forward with NextGen, or do we just leave the development of RPAs over here and they'll just be another user of NextGen? And I'll start with you, John.
Well, first of all, when you look at UASs, and I'll use the phraseology that we use here in the U.S., UASs, there is a focus on UASs in of themselves because of the significant challenges they have, both technically, privacy, and many other issues. But it's impossible for us to look at NextGen without also considering the impact of UAS. At this point in time, there's not a lot of involvement or a lot of focus on UAS as part of the NextGen environment, because this, as my colleagues here have mentioned, we're still many years away from what you would see as a safe integration in the very busiest airspace in our system. I mean, we're just not there yet, and it'll be a number of years. But as we go further down the road, and as they get closer and closer to doing that, there'll be a bigger and bigger focus on it under the NextGen environment.
Okay, good. Martin, can you comment on that as well?
Yes, I'm with John on that. Just to add to that a little bit, I think that the bottom line is, if we want to integrate into the airspace, they have to meet the same safety standard. And there's certainly work going on. For example, ADS-B, there's work being going on micro versions of that. If they get to the point where UAVs of any size have that sort of capability, it's going to be a lot easier to integrate them, not to say there aren't other issues. So I think really it's setting that bar, and by the time they get there, they will just be another user. So I agree with John, they need to be accommodated, but it shouldn't be designed around them either.
Okay, very good. Mitch, what do you think?
Very much in line with what both John and Martin said. The aviation system block upgrades, really it's a systems architecture. And if you're going to take a systems architecture approach to really the future of air navigation, you have to consider all the players that are going to be in that system. So as we move ahead from Block 0, which we're currently in, to Block 1 and Block 2 and Block 3 of the aviation system block upgrades, there are modules of those block upgrades which specifically apply to the integration of remotely piloted aircraft. But it's not all of a sudden. It's an incremental approach, as was described by my colleagues.
You know, I've heard all three of you really underscore the importance of safety here. And, you know, you're dealing with high-level safety concerns and assuring the public, you know, what other steps do you think you can take to assure the public that safety is the prime directive here in RPA, UAS integration versus the very technical work that's got to be done? You know, You know, what can we do as an industry to assure them that there is a process that's going to be followed to ensure safety out there?
Well, maybe I'll start out, and it's really, I think, relatively short answer, and that is by taking very slow, deliberative steps before letting UASs into the more busy airspace. There is a perception, and it's built by some of the promotions like Amazon.com and many others, that we are imminently set for seeing UASs. You be on a flight, commercial flight for Delta Airlines, for example, you look out the window and you're going to see a UAV fly by. and we're not going to see that anytime soon. So I think if the public sees, that this thing not happening, and we publicly, the FAA, and we've been very much out there letting people know, let the public know that we will not allow these UASs come into the system until we are completely sure that they are safe. I think that's a great step to educating the public.
Yeah. Martin, any?
I think the industry, the UAS industry, has demonstrated that they're very keen to keep it as safe, because obviously if they get a bad reputation, that's going to affect their future from many points of view. I think that the short term, the bigger challenge is probably the uninformed users, the recreational, the people who don't realize even if they're commercial, they have some responsibilities. So I think it's the promotional educational pieces where we have the most work to do in the short term, because those are the people who are popping up on the approach to an airport because they have no idea of the consequences of that action.
You know, Mitch, from the international perspective, do you see, John and Martin alluded to educating people, the commercial interests that want to do this and may not even be aware that there need to be standards put in place? Are you seeing that on the international front as well, or hearing of that in the international front as well?
Well, absolutely. When I take a look at the composition of the UAS study group, we had a certain number of people in that study group that were representative of, I'll call it the RPA industry. And then we have the main core of international aviation today, the regulators, the industry, and the pilots also on the UAS study group. So you kind of saw two different approaches, and it was a matter of, to some extent, educating, and it took quite a period of time to educate the RPA industry on what are the expectations for safety in our international environment, especially if you're going to start operating in unsegregated airspace. So I agree, the incremental approach is essential. I also feel that it's very important that to the extent possible, we take the robust safety systems, including safety management systems, that we utilize today in manned operations, and we apply those to the extent possible for remotely piloted aircraft operations.
Thank you very much for that segue, because that's the area I want to go into now, is a safety management system. And I think I'll start with you, Martin. What lessons have you learned in Canada with SMS? I think a lot of people look to Canada as being, you've been there for a while. And what lessons have you learned, good and bad?
We've learned many lessons, I guess is the short answer. I think there's two aspects. I mean, SMS is the expectation of the industry. We've come a long way with it. In 2009, we made a conscious decision to pause, because particularly the smaller parts of the industry were concerned about the complexity. We also had employees who weren't sure that they were ready. And again, it was perhaps the education piece. So it wasn't, people generally speaking agree with the concepts, but what does that look like in reality? But then also the other big piece was, how does that affect our surveillance program? You know, if you're asking companies to take a systems-based approach, it's very hard to go in there with the traditional inspection tools. You know, you have to modify that. So we did a lot of work on that, and that has also been a big learning experience. So I think those two things have started to coalesce, and we're starting to have the discussion about moving on into other areas, even though we have 95% of our flight ops under SMS rules in terms of passenger miles. We see the need to cover all elements of the industry. The airports already have, but all the maintenance organizations. If you're going to be in a system, then the whole system needs to be playing by the same rules. So there's still decisions being made about exactly what and when, but that's where we're moving to at present.
Okay, very good. John, can you give us an update on where SMS is here in the U.S.?
We're actually quite further along than maybe some people might see. And Martin really brought up a number of key components that I think is very much transcends to the United States. We don't have a rule yet. We don't have a mandate. We are in the process of doing the rulemaking. But instead of waiting for the rule to come out, we have developed a pilot program with dozens of airlines in the United States, which comprise of, as Martin said, well over 90% of the traveling public. And what we're seeing is we're seeing a variety of different maturity levels of the SMS system in a variety of the different airlines. But what is really important about SMS, and this is that I think is exciting, is Martin alluded to it, is when the airlines get to a very sophisticated level of SMS, a very high level of maturity, it is going to fundamentally change the way the FAA conducts its surveillance. The surveillance necessary for an airline that does not have an SMS requires a certain level of oversight that you might suspect. But if an airline is doing all the things of an SMS, collecting data, analyzing the data, developing safety enhancements, implementing them, checking the effectiveness of them. If an airline is doing that, the FAA doesn't have to have the same level of oversight than we did without it. And then we can put our resources on the more critical areas of the safety system. So we really see SMS as a tremendous boon to safety in the system. But also, the other thing that I wanted to mention is we also are developing our own internal SMS system. Our staffing is based on risk-based management, decision-making. Many of the other decisions that we're doing internally in the FAA is fundamentally based on risk-based decision-making, which is a key component of SMS.
Very interesting. You know, a lot's been said about just culture, and, you know, I think fundamental to SMS is voluntary safety. Mm-hmm. And, you know, often I certainly hear in some of the meetings that I go to, well, you know, relations between employees and their interaction and their reporting of voluntary data is a management labor issue. But honestly, just culture, I think, is what brings good data to the table. Where do you see the regulator's role in promoting just culture to at the operator level and getting that mindset over that the operator really needs to focus in on providing that kind of environment to get good information? What can you do as a regulator on that?
Well, I think the FAA has had a long, great history of promoting voluntary reporting systems. The one classic example of how successful voluntarily reported data can be shown is in the Commercial Aviation Safety Team, which has been in existence since the late 90s when we were experiencing quite a bit of accidents in the United States. And we created this government-industry collaboration where we would actually bring data to the table, share data, in a just culture environment. And as a result of looking at that data, we were able to develop a number of safety enhancements. You know, when two different groups of people are looking at the same data, it's very difficult to reach different conclusions. What I've often seen is when you're looking at different kinds of data is where you see the disagreements between one group versus another. And as a result of the Commercial Aviation Safety Team activity, as a major contributor, we've seen the accident rate, the commercial fatal accident rate in the United States drop 80%. So what we see in the future now is increased voluntary reporting of information. Because remember, you otherwise will never see that data if it's not voluntary, if we don't provide a culture and an environment where people feel comfortable with submitting that information. So I see that as even being a bigger role in the future.
Martin, have you had success in Canada with that issue of promoting the just culture for all the reasons John just, you know, illustrated?
I believe we've had success, and as with any industry, there's people who embrace things quickly, and there's others to take a little longer. There's two aspects to it. From the industry point of view, it's very clear to us that where we see the just culture, it's really driven from the top down, right? You can encourage people, but if that's not supported at every level, where senior management takes the leadership, they want that culture to exist, that's where it works. If that doesn't happen at senior level, then people are obviously not comfortable and it doesn't work. You asked what our role is. I think one of the things that we can do as government is to be a bit of a role model in the sense, if you're talking about developing trust, it's the old issue, well, who's going to go first? So as government, we have the opportunity to take that role and say to the industry, we're doing our best to trust you and hopefully develop that trust sort of between the companies and ourselves. So, quite apart from the systems, but just in the relationships, when they get a problem, what we see is, people are much more likely to pick up the phone today and say, we've got this problem. We don't know what we're doing about it yet. We just told you that we know about it and we're on it. Whereas in the past, we may never have heard about it. So I think that there has been a lot of success, but there are still areas where we could make progress.
One thing that we always talk about in voluntary safety is, obviously de-identified data, creating aggregate data and information that we can act on. But there's always a discussion of what about litigation? And Mitch, I'm interested, ICAO has just made some changes with regards to protecting data from litigation. Maybe you can highlight for us.
Chuck, if I can, I'd just like to provide some backdrop for this. In this room, when we're talking primarily a North American population, or maybe if we were talking primarily European population, we talk about just culture. Everybody in the room understands exactly what we mean. If you talk about that globally, what a just culture is, there's a lot of room for interpretation, and that's just natural. Whenever you talk about something that is just and culture, that is open to interpretation internationally. So what we focused in on is exactly what you mentioned, is the protection of safety information. It's difficult because you're talking about a balance between protecting safety information for the cause of safety and the need for proper administration of justice in varying justice systems. So initially, the ICAO work in that area was the so-called Attachment E to Annex 13, which talked about guidance on the protection of safety information. And at that point of maturity, it could only be guidance on the protection of safety information. Coming out of the high-level safety conference of 2010, the countries of the world gave us clear guidance. Guidance was that we needed an annex that was devoted to safety management processes, and we needed to focus in on protection of safety information. So just November last year, the newest annex to the suite of annexes we have to the Chicago Convention came out, Annex 19, Safety Management. It also included what we call an attachment, which is guidance on the protection of safety information. So what have been the latest changes? Well, we've had a safety information protection task force that's met for the past 3 years. It's been very difficult work. They came forward just a few months ago to the Air Navigation Commission of ICAO with a proposal to, at least in Annex 19, as it talks about the type of information that would be used in a safety management system or state safety program, how could we upgrade our guidance to a standard? So a proposal went before the commission, was accepted. It covers basically 3 areas. That one area that I mentioned about standards concerning a need to balance the use of safety information for safety purposes with that, let's say, of proper administration of justice. Other area, major areas, establishment of standards to ensure that safety information is used for its intended purposes. So if you're collecting information for an intended purpose, let's make sure it's used for that purpose. And then determine the levels of protection appropriate to circumstances. So different levels of protection of the safety information. These are important proposals, and these go across those interpretations of what are just cultures. It goes across the different types of judicial systems that are out there in the world. This is an initial proposal. It will go out for consultation with states and international organizations. The pilot International community will have their opportunity to comment on these proposals. We're expecting the proposals to come back to ICAO for final review in about January next year, and we're hoping that these new standards could become applicable in the November timeframe of 2016.
Very good. Martin and John, do you see any changes as the result of what Mitch is developing up there in ICAO? Do you see any immediate changes that we'll see here in the U.S. or Canada with regards to that?
Well, Martin, if it's
Go ahead,
okay,
go
I'll
ahead.
begin. No, I don't, because I think we've been very, very diligent and very, we take very high importance of protecting information. I can reflect back on the 2000s. It was very difficult to get airlines and pilots to come to the table to share information. And I think at the root of the problem, at the root of the reticence of them to come to the table was mistrust of the FAA, of perhaps retribution and et cetera, and sharing the data. What we've learned is we have developed a community of both management, labor, and the FAA of holding at the highest level the tenet of protecting data and information. That is, if we can't do that, I can assure you all the data will dry up.
Yeah.
And they'll all go away. And so I think we're already there. I really do applaud the ICAO work because I do think it's going to help many of the other states that perhaps don't hold this to the same degree that the United States does.
Martin, anything you want to add to that?
No, I think just the challenge we've seen in some areas is just trying to deal with an open reporting culture. At the same time, confidential reporting systems. The two protections are quite different. How do you bring those together
Right.
in the longer term to make it open? And certainly that's been a challenge. We are missing some protection. There's something we need to put into our Aeronautics Act to provide that protection. We did try once before, and there was a lot of debate around SMS. We never got to that protection, but it's something we're going to go back to. And that's really to protect the individuals. It's not to say the companies themselves need that guidance, but just making sure there is some overriding authority there.
Good. Okay, I want to just, we've had, the last 2 days, we've alluded to certainly the tragedy of Malaysia 17, and of course, there's a lot of dialogue still about the disappearance of Malaysia 370. And, certainly within the last few weeks, a lot of spotlight has come on ICAO as far as what is the role in ICAO in accident investigation and safety. And so, Mitch, I was wondering if you would share, give us a prediction of where you think this is going. ICAO has really come in the front here now in this area.
Thanks, Chuck. I think it'd be wise to break this up into two different issues, because I think we have two really distinct issues, Malaysia 370 and Malaysia 17. So I'll address a little bit about what I'll call the community is doing in relationship to Malaysia 370 first. We don't know very much about what happened to Malaysia 370. The only thing that we do know is that we can't exactly locate where it is. That's the only thing that we know at this point. So the community got together. We organized a multidisciplinary meeting on global flight tracking in March of this year. This brought together both governments and industry to start to talk about this issue and start to set some near-term, mid-term, and long-term objectives for the future in respect of tracking airplanes. So the near-term objectives, I have to applaud an initiative made by IATA in moving ahead in tracking airplanes on a global basis. So there's a commitment made by IATA to work ahead on this issue, in particular taking a look at those areas where there isn't surveilled airspace and the potential exists for airplanes, let's say, not to be tracked presently at the rate that we would like them to be tracked at. So IATA formed a aircraft tracking task force, the so-called ATTF. The ATTF is really a broad cross-section of our aviation industry. So it involves the regulators, it involves the airline industry itself, it involves the major airframe manufacturers, Airbus, Boeing, Bombardier, Embraer. It involves the air navigation service providers worldwide. It also involves the airline pilots through your international federation. So that group is meeting, has been working diligently ahead on near-term measures to implement flight tracking, be able to locate airplanes on a worldwide basis throughout their flight. That's the objective. We expect that their recommendations will come forward from IATA to their governing boards for implementation at the end of September. In parallel with this, but directly connected with that, is what we call a concept of operations. So as our ability to more robustly track airplanes improves, we want to make sure that the system that would need to respond to an abnormal flight situation can equally and robustly respond to that. The objective, of course, is to search and rescue people within a reasonable period of time if there are survivors. So we have to look at the entire infrastructure, and we're looking at a concept of operations that more closely integrates what airlines would be doing in terms of their tracking of airplanes and how that fits into the overall air navigation system. So again, this group, it's working in parallel. It's a group that consists of the, I would call the leading members of the community in the air navigation infrastructure, what we call the chairs of our technical panels, working with the Air Navigation Commission, also having liaison over to the Aircraft Tracking Task Force in developing this concept of operation. They're looking for the concept of operation to be in draft form for consideration by the end of September as well. So the two groups, they're working in parallel, but there's cross-pollination. So the part of the concept of operations that applies to airlines and what they would do in terms of aircraft tracking, that part of the concept of operations is being drafted by the airlines. And we're looking for an integrated system ahead. So ultimately, in summary, the Aircraft Tracking Task Force will come up with its recommendations to the industry end of September, and the group developing the concept of operations for a system-wide approach, their recommendations by the end of September.
What about Malaysia 17 as far as the role, as far as accident investigation? Do you see any changes coming down the pike for that?
In the history of what ICAO has done in actually providing advice, going on fact-finding missions in support of an accident investigation, I don't think conceptually that's changed much with Malaysia 17, and I think I need to kind of follow through on a little bit of a timetable of what the events were and what ICAO's role has been to spell that out. I will say that we may have had a little bit more of a role than we've had in the past, given the circumstances that this occurred in, and it certainly spelled out a path for some future work that I'll briefly describe. So, as you all know, the tragic event occurred on the 17th of July, 2014. Within 5 days, we had a team of people in the Ukraine to provide advice to the government of Ukraine in this accident investigation. So the role of ICAO was to provide advice, to provide guidance on all the relevant aspects of the convention, the Convention on International Civil Aviation, and the provisions, the international provisions of Annex 13 as it pertains to accident investigation. It was also there as a fact-finding mission and to ensure that all of the evidence is thoroughly considered. Now, all this is very much consistent with the United Nations Security Council resolution, which called for a full, thorough, and independent international investigation consistent with international guidance. And I think you can imagine in the circumstances that this occurred that the international community made a strong call on ICAO to participate in this process. So Where we've been a little bit more involved, I'd say, than in past occurrences, we did participate with the international community in getting a proper handover of the recorders to the appropriate authorities. In addition to that, we basically provided some looking over the shoulder as the recorders the information was downloaded from both the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder. And we'll continue our guidance and support. But I think what this did, and I listened intently to the previous panel, and these comments are very consistent with that previous panel. Just last week, the president of the Council of ICAO and the Secretary General of ICAO convened a CEO-level meeting between ICAO, IATA for the airlines, ACI for the airports, and CANSO representing the air navigation service providers worldwide. They jointly, when they got together, condemned the use of weapons against civil aircraft. And they found together and made a joint statement that the downing of Malaysia 17 is unacceptable. So here's where the challenge is. Almost immediately after the event, we came out with a state letter. This is how we inform all the states and the industry. We reminded the states of what their obligations are to do risk or threat assessments, and as was previously mentioned, to mitigate for that within the airspace above their sovereign territory, the coordination that a state is responsible for between its civil and military sectors, the coordination that's necessary to air traffic services and to the operators. But in the world today, as was mentioned in the previous panel, there are countries that are at conflict. And those countries can't always carry out, for obvious reasons, all of the threat assessment, the risk mitigation, because they're in the midst of a conflict, and they may not always have that capability to do that. So coming out of this meeting on the 29th of July, it was agreed to form a high-level task force. It's called the High-Level Task Force on Risks to Civil Aviation Arising from Conflict Zones. There will be high-level representatives from regulatory authorities from states, high-level officials from industry, and also the pilot community that has a very strong vested role and interest in this will also be present during the task force meeting. Task force will have its first meeting next, I believe it's Thursday and Friday. It's the 14th and 15th of August. They've been given a clear mandate to come forward with recommendations, and I'll characterize the recommendations in just a second, what their recommendations are to the international civil aviation community within 8 weeks. That's a tight time frame. It's a little bit unusual in the ICAO context of things, to be quite honest with you. So that might be a slightly different rule. So to characterize the recommendations, making sure that the right information gets to the right people at the right time. And how do we go forward in that? Thanks, Joe.
No, thank you very much. That's very interesting. We'll keep posted on that. I want to give you an opportunity to ask some questions. All three of our panelists are willing to take your questions, may or may not be on anything we've discussed so far. In light of what Mitch just said, how can the U.S. and Transport Canada participate or encourage or even direct the international dialogue that's going on? Obviously, we have a strong NTSB here. We have a strong TSB up in Canada. What roles do you see playing as this discussion goes on and we see some changes that may result from this?
Yeah, I think that there's certainly a role, and we are part of that task force, but it's actually my colleague on the security side. Mm-hmm. But I think it's inevitable that the security and safety are going to be interwoven. So I think ourselves and probably FAA are going to have a role to play from a safety point of view in supporting some of the solutions will be implemented through safety improvements, perhaps in design or whatever it is. It's not just about the intelligence, it's how you implement that. So I think we'll both be very engaged.
We are very much engaged in the task force, the ICAO task force, and I'd like to echo the previous comment that IATA really, I think, came out very quickly about the need for some form of continuous monitoring or monitoring of aircraft during difficult periods of flight. While I'm not here to describe or discuss established U.S. policy towards our position on that, I do think it's fair to say that it's very difficult for anyone to say that we shouldn't have something different than what we've had, because it really, from an aviation safety standpoint, to have an airplane simply disappear and not know why is a setback to aviation safety. There's no doubt about it. So we do need something. It's really all comes down to what form does that take.
Very good. We do have a text question.
Yes, good morning. One of the questions that has come in, we've had a few. Is it true that airlines in Canada, this question is for Martin, cannot advertise for type-rated pilots when looking for new hires in Canada?
That particular issue is a labour issue as opposed to an aviation safety issue. There is discussion on that. I'm not sure if I want to give you a blunt answer because I'm not 100% sure, even though I'm familiar with the subject. So it's really around foreign workers and who you advertise for, because the foreign workers are only permitted if there's a labour shortage. So what are you looking for when you look at domestic resources first? So I don't really want to answer the question because I think I want to make sure that it would be precise. But that's actually a labour market issue which belongs to a different department. It's not a transport. Even though we validate their foreign licence, we only do that with the agreement of our ESDC. Sorry, I can't even remember what the acronym stands for. It used to be our Human Resources Ministry. They've changed their name of late, but it's really an issue in that area. So we're engaged, but we're not the lead on that decision.
Okay. Sir.
Bob says from United. I apologize to set up this question. I kind of have to give a mini speech here, but Mr. Hickey, you said that SMS and a well-running ASAP program as a complement to it will save the FAA money in that it's kind of a bit of a force multiplier. And I think everyone in here agrees that if you've got a robust reporting culture, you don't have to send the inspectors to the cockpits as often. But there's a regulation or a circular AC 12066C that's coming out soon. It's been promised to come out next week for the last few years, so it's supposed to come out in a couple of weeks. Some of the rumors that we're hearing about this may be some issues with things like sole source. So a pilot reports something that there's no other way that you could find out about it, and that being the sole source, and still allowing discipline or some sort of action against that pilot. Also, the FAA has taken a stance that they want everyone to go to a template MOU for their ASAP programs, meaning that all the agreements are exactly the same. We at our company for the ALPA side, we're having a hard time with this. The MOU portion is a great way to start a program. If you've got, here's the template, here's how you set up your program, here's the protections that we offer and how the programs are going to work. But we started the program with the FAA. We're in the beginning and we've evolved. And to roll back to what you're going to give to, the new entrant, Billy Bob's Air Service out of Des Moines, makes absolutely no sense to us. The first pilot that is taken to task over a sole source report will end all information coming to the FAA. All of it. And I don't think that's the intent. I think that is a very, very big mistake that the FAA is missing. And so I urge you to work with the people at the headquarters and say, look, guys, if you've got an established program that works, like at United and most of the airlines here, don't touch them. Let them go. If you're trying to avoid the 30-page MOU that somebody has, then give them the template and say, look, that's if you got 30 pages, it's not working anyway. If you, like ours, for instance, is the template plus a few paragraphs, 1 or 2 paragraphs, and that's it. But if you're going to take those away, we lose. Is there anything that you can tell us as a body that is what you said earlier was you're assuring us that these are protected and you want the information. You're going to lose the information if you go down that path that we're being told we're going to have to go down. What can you tell us about that?
Well, first of all, let me back up to maybe the very beginning of what you were commenting on. When I mentioned SMS and I talked about how it would sort of drive a very different surveillance model, I certainly am not speaking about specifics about whether we're going to be in the cockpit or not, so please don't misunderstand. We would tailor surveillance programs to individual airlines depending on the nature of their SMS program. So I don't want to be on record as saying I was specific to any part of surveillance programs. Now, to your main point, again, I will echo back that we very much support the need to get single source information, because if we don't get that, we'll lose valuable information. And that information must be protected. I can't emphasize that enough, that is a very important thing. I got to be honest with you, I don't know. I'm not familiar with AC 12066 that you were referring to. That seems to be rumors running around that might undermine that. I don't know that. So the only thing I can say is I will go back and take a look at what's going on there, and in fact see if it would sort of undermine the very nature of what we just talked about. I'll take that back.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, is we don't want to do anything, even for at the sake of expediency. We don't want to jeopardize, because like you say, and I'm sure Martin and Mitch would echo, that sole source and protecting that very high quality data is central to what we're trying to do here. So thank you. I think we have time for one more question, sir.
Yeah, back to the subject of UASs. We appreciate your precautious approach to wide-scale use of UASs, but what can we expect, and this is a sort of a professional speculation, what will the public see as the first use of UASs, and how far away is that? That's just a speculation. I'm not going to hold you to it.
But I can tell you that we already have real estate agents taking aerial photographs of expensive houses, because that's the way they sell. Camera crews, commercial, in a lot of commercial work, sort of for TV commercials. There's a lot of applications, and I think they're already, certainly from our perspective, they're already out there. And the way we're comfortable with that is by putting a fence around where they can do it and when, under what conditions. But there's already a multitude. We have farmers looking at their crops because they can get an aerial view of, which is the area where things aren't growing properly. That's a capacity they didn't have before, certainly not at the same sort of cost. So the uses are almost endless, I would say.
What I would add from the United States side is, and maybe not, I think you used the phrase, what would the public see? I will say what the public would be aware of is much along the lines of what my colleague said, is you will see a lot of public entities like Border Patrol and Border Protection. I think the public is well aware of widespread use of those. Pipeline inspections of pipelines and all, and the agriculture use. So that is immediate, and that's going on right now. But I think what the public may be seeing very soon, if not already, is the thing that I mentioned early on about the exemptions that we're giving according to Section 333 in the reauthorization. This is giving exemptions that allow certain entities in certain isolated airspace to operate for a business venture. And one of them was the most common one, I think many of you have heard, the Motion Picture Association. And we granted an exemption to them. So I think you'll see more along those lines. But again, what you're going to see is you won't see them, and this is a great pilot community, you won't see them in Class B airspace anytime soon.
Mitch, just one last comment for you. Anything you can say internationally? Are there hot spots of UAS RPA development beyond the United States and the U.S. that you've seen wrapping up as far as development?
Well, just to give you an idea of the size of the industry, right now for commercial airframes, there are about a half dozen countries that are involved as the final producers of commercial airplanes of today. Our estimates put it between 40 and 50 states that are presently involved in either the design or manufacture of remotely piloted aircraft today.
Well, we could talk for hours. There's a lot of questions. I'm very grateful to our panel. I appreciate you coming here and speaking on these subjects. Would you please join me in thanking them for their time to join us today?